Well, if philosophy is the search for ultimate answers, then in the modern era, our Western culture went down a path of looking for these ultimate answers, just trying to use reason by itself. But as I've tried to point out over the last few weeks, this path hit several dead ends. And when this path ran into several dead ends, it caused people, thinkers in Western culture, to try a new path to find ultimate answers. And this path I've been calling faith by itself. Now, I think it's hard to understand why people did that, why they tried this new path, until you understand how reason hit all of those dead ends. Because this new path, especially for us pre-modern thinkers, which I assume most of us are, this new path, faith by itself, seems very, very strange. But when reason by itself hit all these dead ends, it's like people had nowhere else to go. Sometimes I think of it almost as like a cornered animal, where you get an animal cornered and it has nowhere to go and it does something extreme or out of the normal for that animal. And it seems like Western culture was kind of in that situation. They were stuck in a dead end, stuck in a corner, and then just out of desperation went down this new path because they had nowhere else to go. So when reason by itself hit all these dead ends, people started looking elsewhere for answers. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, they looked internally for these answers. And they're going to describe this differently, but it's all subjective, it's all internal. So some down this new path will talk about the will, the human will, or our choices. Others will emphasize our internal experiences, our feelings. Others will emphasize our desires, maybe our passions is where meaning to life comes from. But all of these things are internal. All of them are subjective. And so this is the story of how objective truth died out and subjective truth was born. And it's something that we're even seeing in the presidential election. There's a lot of people are upset and wondering, why don't we just talk about objective facts? Why are we just stuck in this rhetoric? Well, this is one of the reasons, is because our culture has moved away from objective facts and it's more about our feelings and our subjective responses to things. And rhetoric churns people's wheels instead of reason and logic nowadays. It's a rhetoric and feelings and emotions. And this is all part of the path that we've been going down for 200 years now. Now, I call this path faith by itself. And for a lot of Christians, at least at first, this is very confusing to them. Because a lot of Christians, they think, how could faith ever be a bad thing? Faith is always good, right? Well, it depends on what you mean by faith. So let me give you an example. Here's Mark Twain, famous author from the 1800s, the time period we're going to be looking at tonight. And Mark Twain famously said that faith is believing in something that you know ain't so. And I would argue that that type of faith is not a good thing. So no, faith isn't always a good thing. This pre-modern understanding of faith, this irrational, subjective, blind, leap-in-the-dark type faith, leap of faith, is not good, in my opinion. My position is that it is not a good understanding of faith, not a good thing. So remember, I'm a pre-modern thinker. I advocate for a pre-modern way of thinking. And so my position would be that faith is when you trust something, but that trust, that decision to trust, is based on good reasons and evidence. It's when you break faith away from reason that it becomes something completely different. And that's what I'm saying is a bad thing. This blind, irrational, subjective feeling is what faith has become in this postmodern era. And not only has that happened to the Christian faith, but just people's thinking in general. Whatever they believe in, they don't believe it based on reasons and evidence. They believe it because it gives them meaning in their life. But this all began in the early 1800s. So here's another quote from another famous thinker in the 1800s, Benjamin Franklin. He said that the way to see by faith is to shut the eye of reason. So it's this type of faith that I'm arguing against, not Christian faith, not a pre-modern understanding of Christian faith. According to this understanding, you put your faith in something not because you have good reasons and evidence, but because it's helpful. It gives your life meaning and purpose. You just choose it because it makes you feel good, so to speak. You don't use reason to try to figure out if what you're putting your faith in is true or not. It is true for you if it provides you meaning. That's why some things can be true for you and not for me. Maybe Christianity gives you meaning and purpose in life, then it's true for you, but maybe Buddhism gives me meaning. It gives me purpose to my life, so then it's true for me. And so this whole shift in thinking redefines faith, and it even redefines what it means to be true. And this is the way that most people think today. In other words, what is the meaning of life? Well, it's whatever you want it to be. That's how we find ultimate answers, is we choose whatever we want. Again, where does this thinking come from? It seems really silly to us. It seems really silly to a lot of people at first when they're first exposed to it, especially if they're a pre-modern thinker. But I tell you, this way of thinking, this what I call stage 6, is a lot better than the absolute hell of stage 5. Again, this is kind of the cornering of the animal, right? If somebody is in stage 5 and they think that there is no meaning and there is no purpose to life, that is a crushing conclusion. I mean, that people in that stage struggled with suicide and depression. And that is think of the artist that we looked at who were struggling with the conclusions of stage 5. It's devastating. It's really a hell in your thought and your understanding of life if you conclude there is no meaning and purpose to anything. And so there's a sense in which I can sympathize that to escape the hell of stage 5, we're just going to lash out on whatever we could grab onto that might give us some hope, even if it's as silly as this idea that we just create our own hope, because that's better or more, not as painful at least as stage 5. In other words, if there's no meaning out there, if there's no meaning and purpose out there or up there, then the only place left to look is in here, subjectively. And so we look inside. We give meaning to life in this way of thinking. We don't wait for life to give us meaning. We give the meaning to life. Now, as we've talked about, just a little bit of review, Kant played a huge role in this move to subjective truth. Kant's whole system really moved people's thinking internally, because his focus was on the internal subjective things. And there's all sorts of ways that Kant's system did that. moving the focus more internally and subjective as opposed to external objective truth. He did this in his attempt to rescue reason and science. Remember, he rescued absolute certainty from Hume by focusing on our subjective perception of reality. Not reality itself, that's not where absolute truth is, or absolute certainty. Absolute certainty can be found within, in our perception of reality. But even worse, in Kant's attempt to rescue faith, he cut faith off completely from reason, and that's when faith became an irrational leap, just a subjective feeling that's completely separated from reason. He had good motives, maybe, good intentions. He was trying to protect the Christian faith from being disproven from reason and science. But in doing this, he moved faith internally to protect it from objective facts. So maybe even if a good intention, still a bad conclusion. We talked last week how two paths then diverge from Kant's thinking. And the first path is just an extension down that reason by itself path, stage 5. The conclusion, there are no ultimate answers, reason's a dead end for ultimate answers. This path rejects all sorts of metaphysics, all sorts of transcendent ideas or a transcendent realm. And we kind of walked down that path all the way through the 1900s to see where it led. And it included that big movement, remember, analytic philosophy. Well, now we're going to focus for the rest of the semester on stage 6. And this is the other path that came out of Kant. And this is full-fledged postmodernism, faith by itself. It includes the movements that we're going to be looking at called continental philosophy. It's called continental because a lot of the thinkers were on the continent of Europe, France and Germany. And there are several movements that are part of continental philosophy. And we're going to see all of them, though, encourage this irrational faith, these religious beliefs that are based on feeling and emotion. They agree with stage 5 that reason is a dead end, reason is not useful. They agree that according to reason, man is just a machine, but we can take this irrational leap of faith and believe in whatever, Christianity, God, love, free will, Buddhism, whatever gives you meaning. You can take that irrational leap and have faith in whatever you choose. And nobody can disprove it with reason and evidence because these are two separate, complete categories. So this stage 6, they're saying the answers come from inside of you. There's no meaning and purpose up there. There's no meaning and purpose out there, like the modern era said. Meaning and purpose is found within, in here. So this is a really interesting quote I came across this last week. We haven't talked about this thinker, Blaise Pascal, but he was a well-known Christian philosopher and also a famous mathematician. When I was studying to be an actuary, I had to study Pascal's probability theory. And at the time, I was just studying his mathematics, and I had no clue that he was a Christian philosopher until later when I was studying philosophy in my PhD. I came across him again and found out that he was a Christian philosopher. So I think this quote from him, I think he wraps it up really well. He said, there are two equally dangerous extremes. One of them is to exclude reason completely, and the other is to admit nothing but reason. And I think he sums up these two extremes even before they happened. Because he wrote this before, well, maybe during the modern era. So maybe he could see where things were going. Regardless, admitting nothing but reason was the failure of modernism, right? That's why I called it reason by itself. And excluding reason is the failure of postmodernism. Whereas, as I've been advocating, and it seems like Pascal would as well, that a pre-modern way of thinking, where faith and reason work together. So now what we're going to do for the rest of the night is we're going to look at the first postmodern movement. We're kind of going to go back in time now. We walked through where stage 5 went, the analytic philosophical movement all the way down through the 1900s, even down to today, and saw that there's been actually a pre-modern resurgence within analytic philosophy. So we went down stage 5 all the way till today. Now we're going to go back in time and start again at the 1800s, early 1800s, and see stage 6 develop. And so the rest of the semester we'll just be walking down this path and seeing the different movements in stage 6 in the 1800s and 1900s. And what I would say is the first postmodern movement is a movement called Romanticism. Romanticism was a huge movement. Most people will place it from approximately 1800 to 1840. None of these movements have exact dates, obviously, but just so you can get a frame of mind, frame of reference, early 1800s is the Romantic movement. Now, Romanticism is well known for its paintings, of course. We looked at some Romantic paintings a couple weeks ago. But even more so, it's known for its literary works. So Romantic literature is hugely famous. There's still movies being made from the literature that was written as part of this movement. So you've seen, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Les Miserables, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Frankenstein, Dracula. All of these things come out of the Romantic movement. It's very well known for its literature, poems, poetry, short stories, novels, Edgar Allan Poe, Lord Byron, Don Juan, Coleridge, Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Keats. I mean, some of these are the biggest names in poetry and literature. And there's a reason for that. We'll see why they're so popular. And there's a lot of things that I think you'll agree with in Romanticism. There's a sense in which Romanticism is critiquing the reason by itself path, right? And I've been critiquing that path as well. So there's some ways that you will probably agree with Romanticism. I do. But like always, it seems like they're reacting to modernism, reacting to the reason alone path, but then they overreact to it. And so they go to an extreme the other direction. And that's where I'll criticize the movement. But, some of these works I love as well. And I appreciate some of the points they're trying to make against modernism through their writings. I'm probably the biggest fan of the dark romantics. Surprise, surprise. But I'll even watch a Jane Austen movie from time to time. Okay. So let me try to summarize the Romantic movement in 6 points. Okay. Now I'm calling it the first postmodern movement because it was the first movement that really criticized modernism. Hume, Kant, they criticized reason a little bit, but they were still part of the modern movement. Whereas Romanticism is a full-fledged attack and rejection of modernism. So if I can summarize the movement here in 6 points, the Romantics, they rejected the idea that reason and science were the ultimate form of knowledge. You know, I can relate to that. I can sympathize with that rejection. They rejected, vehemently, they rejected the idea that the world, or we would say the universe nowadays, is a vast, well-oiled machine. They despised that way of looking at things. Remember, that was the huge movement of the 1700s. Newton's laws of motion, deism, the modern movement, that's how they thought of everything, as machines. The deterministic laws of nature. Along with that, they strongly rejected the idea that human beings are merely machines. So that's what they rejected. They rejected a lot of the thinking of the modern era. So what instead did they offer as the solution? And this here is where I will critique them, because I think their solution just went too far the other way. So they emphasized the inner life. This would make sense of a lot of, Jane Austen's work and the poems, and that's why it's called Romanticism, because there's a lot of feeling and emotion and passion and desire part of this movement. That's why they're called the Romantics. They emphasize the inner life of passions and desires and emotions, feelings. That's what they thought really mattered in life. Not logic, not reason, not rationality. This is what should be our focus, is the inner life, so to speak. As part of this, they emphasized individual creativity and individual spirituality. And that might sound good at first, right? Anything that's spiritual is good, right? But we'll see the path that took them down. Okay, let's go through all these 6 one at a time and just give you some specific examples. So, number 1. Doesn't that look like Johnny Depp, though? It's the first thing I thought of when I saw that romantic painting. Is maybe that's what gives Johnny Depp the inspiration to look the way he does. All right, let's look at number 1. Romanticism rejected the idea that reason and science were the ultimate forms of knowledge. They were reacting against the extreme emphasis that the Enlightenment era put on human reason. They were reacting against that. So they rejected the idea that reason was going to be able to figure everything out. Remember that optimism of the modern era? The 1700s especially. They said in particular, reason cannot even begin to explain or describe the most important parts of life. Our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our love. All of those things are irrational. Reason is not useful here at all. One figure that we're not going to talk about in this class, but it might be somebody you want to do some research on, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau was a thinker in the 1700s, so there's a sense in which he's a precursor for Romanticism. And a lot of the Romantics will draw on Rousseau for their ideas. I'm reading a book right now that points out that a lot of people were drawing on Rousseau in the 1800s, including Karl Marx, the father of communism. So Rousseau might be somebody you want to do your research paper on, because it seems like he was a very influential thinker in the 1700s that instigated, or at least proposed, a lot of these ideas that others came along and followed later in the 1800s. Well, like Rousseau, The Romantics felt that reason and science were not leading to the moral and spiritual progress that the modernist had promised. Remember, the optimism of the modern era was that reason was going to be able to fix all of our problems, our spiritual problems, our physical problems, everything. Make us better people. And Rousseau, and definitely the Romantics later, said, not happening. Reason and science is actually making us worse as human beings. They were very critical of cities and modernization and the urban life, and would point to it and just say, look how terrible urban life and cities are creating us to be these terrible consumer-driven factory workers. And we're not getting better. We're getting worse spiritually and morally because of modernism, because of this emphasis on reason. Another thing that they rejected is this mechanical view of the world, the mechanical view of what we would say the universe nowadays. They rejected the idea that nature could be best understood through these deterministic laws. Think, Isaac Newton's laws of motion, all the scientific laws that were being discovered in the 16 and 1700s. They said, yeah, those laws might be true, but that's not the best way to understand nature. The Romantics, they loved nature and celebrated nature not as a machine with these deterministic laws, order and rationality, but they saw nature as something that was wild and mysterious. Nature was one of those places where you escape the urban life, you escape all of that garbage in the city, you go out to be one with nature. You go out to nature to find your inner passions, to connect and get back to maybe a more primitive lifestyle, where we were just focused on our desires and seeking out our passions and not caught up with all this garbage of reason and laws and cities. Just get back to nature, really. This might ring some bells. Rousseau had this idea of the noble savage. And so it was this kind of idea that if we could just get back to more of a primitive lifestyle, that would be the ideal. Back before we were corrupted with all this reason and rationality, we can just get back to more of a simple lifestyle where we're just pursuing our passions and desires. The third thing we're going to talk about with Romanticism, their rejecting of things, is that they rejected the idea that humans are merely physical machines as well. And we've talked about this before. This idea in the modern era where they concluded we're just machines, human beings, that is. We said especially when Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, that more than any other idea drove that home, that we're just machines programmed through nature, through evolution. Well, the Romantics completely rejected that idea. They pushed back against this idea that we're just programmed machines. And so they emphasized freedom, free will, choices. Just think for a moment about Frank Shelley's book, Frankenstein, written in the early 1800s. I don't know if you've read the original book. We've all seen the movies. But the original book is really good. And think about what she, the author, is wrestling with in that book. Right? Are we just machines? Are we just our physical parts? So if we took, Kristen's legs and Ray's arms and Ethan's head and Xander's heart, if we just took our different physical parts and put them together, could we, make a human being? Is that all we are, just our physical parts? Or are we something more than that? Are we more than just merely physical machines? So, her book, Frankenstein, is wrestling with that. We've turned it into this silly horror movie thing now, but you might want to do your research report on her book and see how she was wrestling with, Romanticism versus modernism. Man is just a machine, modernism versus the romantic idea that no, we're more than merely machines. Okay, so instead, they reject all of these things from the modern era. So instead, what did they propose? And we're going to look at just 3 things, and then we'll be done tonight. So they emphasize, as we've been talking, the inner life. Okay. So they felt what really matters in life is our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our passions, and they understood these things as the non-rational aspects of human life. That was their term. I'm not putting words in their mouth. According to them, these were the non-rational aspects of human life, our desires, our passions. And so a lot of the books and the poetry and the novels that we celebrate, because they're romantic, but what they're emphasizing is the irrational component of our desires and our emotions. So for example, this is where the idea of falling in love was invented. So they come up with this idea that love is just this uncontrollable force that just sweeps over you, and it's irrational. You can't make heads or tails of it. In fact, it's a mistake to try to understand it. It just overcomes you, and you have no choice. You're falling. It's like if you fell off a cliff. You don't have a choice. You're falling. And so falling in love is just this irrational desire that just moves over you, has no rational explanation. And I think we saw that in the Interstellar clip, you might remember, that we watched. Remember Anne Hathaway's character was saying that she should follow her heart, this irrational love. Those very romantic ideas coming through. From the writer, Anne Hathaway is just an actress, right? It's Christopher Nolan who's writing and putting the words in the actress's mouth. So their primary message, of course, was to follow your passions and desires. Follow them. Follow your heart. And, that sounds, I know we're so used to that message that it just has this ringing sound of, oh, that must be a good thing. But if you step back and think about some of the desires you have, do you always really want to follow them? I'll give you an example. Lord Byron. We celebrate his poetry, we celebrate his writing. Lord Byron was one of these romantic writers who followed his heart, wherever it led. And that led him to have multiple love affairs with women, men, and his sister. Because, if you're following your heart. So this is the extremes that I think where I can appreciate their critique of modernism. They overreacted, at least some of them did, and went too far the other direction. So 2 more things that they emphasized. They emphasized individual creativity. It had a huge impact in the art world, not just paintings, but drama. We've seen literature, music, had a huge impact in the art world. And again, this is where, as I've said many times, that the ideas are often passed down to the culture through artistic means. And so Romanticism is mostly well known for its art. We're going to look at some romantic philosophers later. But one thing that came from the Romantic movement is an emphasis on this individual creativity. They glorified the creative artist, but they redefined what creativity meant. They said to be truly creative, you need to break away from all the strict rules and traditions from the past. In the past, there were set rules or ordered traditions for creating beautiful art. Whether that be music or literature or paintings, there were these rules, these traditions, if you will. And they said creativity is breaking out of those handcuffs, breaking away from tradition. That's what creativity is challenging those traditions, breaking away from those old mechanical rules. And creativity flourished outside of those rules. So if you can break the rules of the past, then you're creative. Doesn't matter if your art is garbage. As long as you break the rules, then you're being creative. So they redefined creativity in a sense. And last, they emphasized individual spirituality. It's true, the Romantic era did lead to a renewed interest in religion, but not, heaven forbid, organized religion. Not any sort of structured religion or rational beliefs in things that are real. What it led to, maybe not a renewal, but a birth of this individual spirituality. So they didn't want the traditions of the past. They didn't want rules, structure, reason, conventions, because all that just crushed your individuality. That crushed your freedom and expression as an individual. So through creativity, you can create your own spirituality. You can create your own meaning for your life. There's some interesting movements that come out of this, and we're not in this class going to be able to chase down all these rabbit trails, but there's this idea of meaning unfolding over time through development, through changes. Meaning develops, not only as an individual, but as a universe, as a whole universe together. Meaning is developing and processing through change. So you might think, or you might jot down the thinker Hegel, Hegel, a huge philosopher in this era, early 1800s. And he, kind of like Kant, is trying to rescue faith, rescue religion, but he ends up completely changing it. And it's this idea of the whole universe kind of, in a pantheistic way, the universe is God. God is the universe. And it's developing meaning through process and change. And it's what led to process theology. So I'm just giving you some names and terms that you can look up if you want to explore more. But a lot of these ideas are beginning right here in the Romantic movement. Pantheism obviously has been around before, but the Romantics are bringing in pantheistic ideas and mystical ideas for this understanding of individual spirituality. Some of the Romantics said that to really achieve a higher level of spirituality, you could take drugs. Opium becomes a very popular way to explore spirituality, to gain a deeper insight into reality through opium. A lot of young people start living in communes. They want to reject the traditional ways that society has lived before. They want to break away from that and go do their own thing, live out closer to nature together as a commune. And you might be thinking, well, this sounds a lot like the 60s hippie movement here in America. And you wouldn't be too off if you thought that. Because there's a sense in which the 1960s American hippie movement, taking drugs, in their case mostly LSD, communes, free love, following your passions, is an outworking of a lot of these ideas. Maybe it took 150 years to develop, but it's the birth of a lot of these ideas. And it's interesting, you go back and you read some of the history of what the Romantic folks were doing in the 1820s, 1830s, and it almost sounds like you're reading about Woodstock. The things they were doing, the way that they were thinking. And all of it, I would say, is just part of postmodernism. So the hippie movement is obviously a different movement than the Romantic movement, but they're all under the umbrella of postmodernism, and so you see some similarities between it. The hippie movement in the 60s is the same thing as the beatnik movement in the 50s in Europe. It just hit Europe first, the beatniks, and then the hippies were what we called them here in the 60s.
We had the beatniks here too.
Was that term used?
Yeah.
I've always heard...
The 50s, the bongos, and especially San Francisco, New York, the beatniks were a big thing.
Okay. I've always just heard the beatnik as a European term, but I'm sure there are people here that used it too.
So you got an eyewitness account here, just in case you wanted to know.
There you go. There you go. Well, the last thing I'll say before we'll wrap it up a little bit early tonight is this postmodern movement, this Romantic movement affected Christianity as well. And, the church, unfortunately, is often influenced by the culture around it. And so a lot of Christian denominations started to buy into some of this thinking. This is one of the reasons why apologetics pretty much died out. Because reason, evidence, that seems so modern. That seems so like the reason by itself path. Reason was so associated with modernism and the Enlightenment that people began to see apologetics as unspiritual, as even unbiblical, because they were being influenced by this Romantic movement. So apologetics became very unpopular. And we'll see next week, we're going to look at two thinkers within the church, really, Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard, who I would say were both Romantic thinkers in the church, and how they influenced generations of Christians to think in these ways. And as I said, this is one of the reasons why apologetics died for about 150 years. 1700s, early 1800s, you see all sorts of apologetic books and arguments and speakers and pastors using apologetics. And then by the time you get around 1850, all that stuff just pretty much dies until the 1970s. So 100 plus years within the church. Reason is looked down upon as a bad thing, as the enemy, really. And it's because of this influence. Now we don't want to go the other extreme too and elevate reason too highly. That's a mistake as well. That'd be the modern mistake, the mistake of modernism. So as I keep advocating for the pre-modern era, where reason has a good role to play. We just don't want to make too much out of it. Okay, I'll wrap things up there, but let's pull out your class schedule to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of assignments, those of you that are taking it online. Those that come on Thursday nights. So I've heard that Caleb, the TA, has graded some of the exams and he's getting those back to you. So you might not have got your exam back yet, but he is grading them and we'll get them to you soon. So you turned in your exam, and this week, see, today is October 22nd, so you had to read chapter 10 in Christian philosophy. So turn in your reading summary to Caleb tonight for that chapter. And you guys can spend some time discussing that as a group here in a few minutes. For next week, there's no reading. I wanted to give you time to work on your research paper. So hopefully by now you have your topic in mind. If you're unsure if your topic is a good one or would fit for this class, let Caleb or I know, and we can probably tell you quickly. And then that is due on November 5th. So 2 weeks from today. So you have no reading for 2 weeks. So use that time to start working on your paper. Don't start your paper the day before or the day of. Let's look at the requirements of the paper. Pull out your syllabus. This is on page 3 of the syllabus. It's worth 30% of your grade, so almost a third. Has to be 8 to 10 pages, double spaced, Times New Roman, 12-point font, or something close to that. Gives you a lot of options to choose from. Things that you're interested in. Pick something that you're interested in to write it on. That'll make it a lot easier to do the research. Find some good sources, right? Don't quote Wikipedia. You can go to Wikipedia maybe to just learn some basic things about your topic, but go to some better sources to actually learn and quote from. Give examples of different things you could do here. So do you guys have any questions about the paper? Well, again, just email me. Those of you taking it online, email Caleb or I. I do want to make a plug-in, and I'll probably do this a lot for the rest of this class, make a plug for the next class. And I'm doing a class next semester, so this is the spring of 2021. Probably start late January, go through April, Thursday nights at my house, 7 o'clock, just like this class, or you can take it online. And the class is going to be philosophy of religion. And I've titled it that class, and I've arranged the syllabus and gave it that title so that the credits, just like this class, will transfer to any college or university. Most all, even secular schools, have a philosophy of religion class. But in my philosophy of religion class, we're going to be doing apologetics. So, for example, if you take a philosophy of religion class at a state university, you'll study a lot of the same stuff that we're going to study. It's just that the professor probably won't take a position. Sometimes they will. Sometimes you've got an atheist professor that is very clear. We're going to study arguments for the existence of God and arguments against the existence of God, and he's going to make it very clear his position. And I don't have a problem with that. So we'll study some of the same material. We'll study arguments for the existence of God, arguments against the existence of God, and I'll put my cards on the table and say that, I find the arguments for God very compelling, and that's why I'm a theist. But, non-theist might take my class, and that's fine. I'm not going to grade them poorly because I disagree with them. But that's what the class is about. It's you would think of it mostly as apologetics. We'll look at arguments for the existence of God, and then we'll look at arguments for Christianity in particular. Why do we think Christianity is true? Reasons and evidence is what we'll look at the whole semester. The basic, as I would see it, apologetic questions. Does God exist? Is Jesus God? Is the Bible from God? And is the Bible all true? So those are the big 4 questions we'll look at in this class, which you can take for literally pennies and then transfer the 3 credits to any school. So help me get the word out. Let folks know about it. We've already got 15 students signed up. but we'd like to get many more, and as many people as possible can take it online. I can only fit so many people in my house, but online we can have all sorts of folks take it from around the world.